Thank you. So you have
Sure.
the floor for the Florida Wildlife Corridor.
Okay, great.
Would you hit the lights, Karen?
Well, and correct me if I'm wrong, Jennifer, but there is no motion. This is purely information.
For last.
And, I'm here to tell you a little bit more
Julie,
about the wildlife corridor, the questions, and
Street Journal has
sort of a conversation you go along. But kind of like Julie said at the beginning,
It's over there.
this initiative is all about collaborative approaches. It's voluntary, there's no
Conservation
restrictions
reasons.
here, and there are. So to start that, my name is Mallory Dimmitt, CEO of Florida Wildlife Corridor Foundation. And I'm going to take us some beautiful photos today, a lot of which come from Colton Ward, who co-founded the Wildlife Corridor as a National Geographic photographer and explorer. But first, start with a little buzz video, because you've probably been hearing a lot about the Florida Wildlife Corridor. It's had a lot of positive press and just mentions over the last few years. So here's a very short buzz video. Maybe.
Did I hit play over here?
Oh, no, let's see if we can try that again. Can you,
Okay.
yeah, maybe. So that's just a little bit of a buzz, and it sounds like we're, getting a lot of media attention, which has been growing over the years. But it didn't start out that way. It started out as sort of an idea of a few committed folks who thought about bringing attention to this corridor concept and vision for the state through a pair of 1,000-mile treks or expeditions that we undertook in 2012 for the sort of that first line showing right now, starting from the Everglades and going all the way to the Okefenokee Swamp in Georgia. And then we were crazy enough to want to do that again in 2015, another 1,000-mile expedition from the headwaters of the Everglades, kind of the midpoint of that first trek, west across the Florida Panhandle. So again, this first one in 2012 started out on the edge of Florida Bay in kayaks. All this was done on kayaks or on foot or a bicycle. And we moved sort of out of the swampy realms of South Florida and up onto the Lake Wales Ridge. We were hosted along the way by 29 different landowners who were interested in the concept and conservation potentially for their lands. And then we ultimately finished, we spent 53 days in the Everglades watershed and the remaining 47 days in the St. Johns River watershed, and ultimately finishing going upstream on the Swanee for 4 days to the Okefenokee National Wildlife Refuge. This is my favorite of Carlton's photos from that first journey, Ogeechee Tupelo. Like I said, we did that again. And in 2015, it was a very wet and cold winter, a lot like this one with, and we started thinking we were still in South Florida in January to go to the Panhandle, which I regretted for a while. So we started in the Green Swamp, worked our way to the coastal swamp forests of the Big Bend region, through Florida Springs country, and ultimately paddling, I think, 14 different rivers across the, in the Florida Panhandle, before finishing and through the longleaf pine forest in the Panhandle, and seeing red-cockaded woodpeckers and all the species that rely on those forests, and by finishing ultimately at Gulf Islands National Seashore on the Alabama-Florida border. And I was joined on those treks. I had the, just opportunity of a lifetime to walk and trek across Florida. And now I've done that for over 2,600 miles. Joined here on the left by Carlton Ward Jr., the photographer, whose images you're seeing, and Joe Guthrie, who's a bear biologist and now runs the predator prey program at Archibald Biological Station in Venus in Highlands County, Glades County. And so after that expedition, we were kind of told that we produced these beautiful long films that was great. People loved the imagery, but they couldn't really understand that this wildlife corridor concept was threatened at all. And so our shorter expeditions that have followed really now take place in a sort of a week-long time frame and focus on areas at the edge of the corridor that are more vulnerable or threatened by forthcoming development, and also using different audience in different themes as focal points. So if I play this, you can just see You're supposed to be able to see shorter treks that have taken place, in 2018, 2019 in this region, 2021 in Springs Country, and most recently last year in the O2O corridor in Northeast Florida, and we have a new film about that one. So I'm going to go through this pretty quick, but that home waters expedition, or in starting in Dunellen on the Rainbow River, we're using now different trekkers than the original ones. That one was 3 teen girls who made a 50-mile trek down the Rainbow River and down the Withlacoochee River to the Gulf Coast and finished with a cleanup in Homosassa Bay. You can find all of these films on our website. They're wonderful, short films. And this Ocala O2O region, Ocala Osceola National Forest that I mentioned from last year, was actually done by 3 military veterans from different branches of the military. And that film is called O2O Path to Connection. It's just going to be coming out next month at Camp Landing, which is really the sort of midway point of that corridor. But it talks about really the overlap of military and conservation efforts, and of course the healing powers of nature. So here are some of those short films, and I'll just point your attention to the Wild Divide, which does take place in this, your region here, at the eastern edge of it, at least for portions of that expedition from 2019. Just a little bit of background. So, we wanted to do these expeditions to show that if you move through the landscape the way at the pace that a panther or black bear would, and we were kind of bringing people's eyes to it, so you didn't have to go on the trek, but you could see it from us as a narrator of that. So part of the impetus for those treks was really this story of one black bear in Florida, M34. You may have heard this, but this black bear traveled 500 miles over a period of about 10 weeks in the summer, I think, of 2009 or 10, and started near Lake Okeechobee, worked his way all the way up to I-4, spent 4 days trying to cross I-4, could never get across, came all the way back down the Kissimmee Chain of Lakes, back to the Lake Okeechobee area, and finally dropped his collar in Glades County. And so we were inspired that if a bear could go, 500 miles, stay all on conservation lands, we could do the same sort of thing. Our treks ended up being 1,000 miles. But this really was the other reason, the real impetus for wanting to bring this to the public's attention and ultimately to decision makers' attention. And this is a study, you've all seen the more updated version of this, but this is the original Florida 2060 report. This is the 2010 baseline that looks at conservation lands in green, developed land in red, and then the projection for 2060. If we do that again from 2010 to 2060, you can see that the investment the state has already made in conservation lands become almost entirely surrounded by developed lands. And so some of them become islands, not connected to each other, but surrounded. And then that study has been updated. And now this is the 2070 version, which is just more intensive. And so what's really important, for us to say up front is we're not anti-development. We understand that there are going to be 33 million people in Florida by 2070 following these projections. How we grow makes all the difference. And so this study that was undertaken by the Thousand Friends of Florida, Department of Agriculture, the same center at UF, Center for Landscape Conservation and Planning, looked at how to accommodate the same number of people coming in 2 different trends. So this 2070 trend is growth as usual. And this alternative accepts the same number of people, but you can see protects more of our open and agricultural land and conservation lands in this vision. And so that alternative on the right is essentially accepting or following the Florida Wildlife Corridor goal for connected conservation. So our mission is to champion a collaborative campaign. That's really important. We're open to everybody. Again, we're not anti-development. We're inclusive of all groups to champion a campaign to permanently connect, protect, and restore the Florida Wildlife Corridor. And just a little bit about what the corridor is and where it is. It's a statewide view here. It's a statewide vision, and it's 18 million acres in size. So some portions of the whole state. There's about 10 million acres that are already in some form of conservation. They're largely public land and some conservation easements that are on private land. And there's 8 million acres that are the opportunity areas, the missing links, the places in between sort of that connective tissue to try to connect up the estate's existing conservation lands. We recognize that not every one of those 8 million acres will be protected, but this is the last best opportunity to have a connected conservation corridor. Again, there's a lot of development happening. This is not a regulatory overlay, but it is the vision for this corridor. And so you saw in that little buzz video that in 2021, the Florida Wildlife Corridor was adopted by the state. The Florida Wildlife Corridor Act was approved with unanimous bipartisan support from our legislators in Tallahassee. It's not often you get to say that, so I like to say it again, unanimous bipartisan support, signed by the governor in July. And along with that, what it does is recognize the geography in state statute, and that is made up of the Florida Ecological Greenways Network, priorities 1 through 3. That's the definition of the wildlife corridor. There are additional priorities. So it's not saying these are the only ecologically important lands in the state. That is absolutely not true. But these are the highest level connections in that prioritized network. There are additional regional and level 4 and 5 priorities in that same network. Along with that first year, that approval came $400 million in funding to the state's land acquisition programs, which is great. They had been relatively flat for a long time, but this sort of renewed us back to the level seen in the 1990s, that we're about $300 million and up a year for Florida Forever. And there's also a newer program called the Rural and Family Lands Program in the Department of Agriculture that largely buys conservation easements. In the 2 years since, there have been at similar levels of funding, and last year a record level funding for land acquisition. And so we recognize that high level, meaningful, consistent funding for the state land acquisition programs is absolutely imperative for the vision for the Florida Wildlife Corridor to be successful. Those programs have gone in cycles for a long time, and there have been, as Julie mentioned, far more landowners interested and on the waiting list than there have been funds available. But the last couple of years has been a great, it's what we continue to support. We also engaged in an economic study, and there's a couple of high-level outcomes. The Florida Wildlife Corridor supports 114,000 jobs in a whole number of sectors, not just recreation, but of course, agriculture principally, and also defense, mining, kind of all kinds of sectors that affect our part of our rural economies. There's $30 billion in annual economic value provided by the corridor, and that we tried to put a value also on those environmental services. So that's a conservative estimate using the best science available to conservatively estimate that. And if you look at the sort of least cost pathways to protecting the corridor and those annual returns, there's a 6x return on investment. But what that study really, and I can point you to the link to where you can find more information on that. But what really was important to me that came out of this study was a paradigm shift to think about how we prioritize protection of the wildlife corridor. So for a long time, I would say the land acquisition programs focus on sort of where you can get the most bang for your buck. And that happens often to be in not right at the edge of development, right, where your dollar stretches a little further in dollars per acre in places that are more remote from potential development, still ecologically important, but I'd say our work is focused more in these areas. And the study really pressed us to be thinking about what are the acres that are going to be lost in this decade. There's 500,000 acres, 500,000 acres that are in the highest threat of projected conversion to incompatible uses with the wildlife corridor in this decade, and also an additional 400,000 acres that's highest ecological value in that next tier of medium threat. So when you put all that together, it's about 900,000 acres that we consider as the highest priority, because you have to start coming up with prioritization within that remaining 8 million acre opportunity area. You can't tackle it all at once. And this just helps us look at what are the places that are going to be lost to development most quickly. Okay, so then when you talk about kind of what comes next, that our goal is to accelerate the pace of conservation statewide, and that has been happening since the passage of the act and with the funding in the last couple of years. In fact, here's an overlay of some recent properties that have been approved for protection by the state in this, how do you say CHNEP boundary? That one, I want to make sure not. So this is your outline, but there's a couple of properties as you can see scattered throughout and across the state in the previous slide. But we also want to we're very interested in developing new and additional ways and pathways and mechanisms for protecting land. So it doesn't always have to be in acquisition. You were just talking about some of the downfalls of, outright acquisition does not allow that to stay on the county tax revenue. easements do stay that way, but they stay in the greenbelt status, right? And so what are the other market mechanisms that landowners can take advantage of that would allow them to continue agricultural production, stay in business, own the land, and manage the land so that it's not a state cost, but perhaps be able to provide habitat and be incentivized to for annual payments that allow the agriculture to continue to be viable and conservation values to continue. So that's a big range there is, market mechanisms for things like carbon, water, habitat, et cetera. And then we want to continue the storytelling and the reach for people to know and care about the wildlife corridor. Some of you probably saw in the last year this Path of the Panther film put out by National Geographic that's brought a lot of attention. Our small films don't have quite the reach that streaming of National Geographic and Disney Plus Path of the Panther film, but it does talk about the need for the wildlife corridor in order for the recovery of the Florida panther ultimately to be successful. That's sort of our focus. We're looking at ways to partner with all kinds of parallel efforts that have a benefit to the wildlife corridor. Last year, Senator Pasadomo's big focus was on trails and the Sun Trail Network, and there was a $200 million bonus, big infusion of cash into the Sun Trail Network. So this was the passage of that Senate Bill 106 from last year. And then also thinking about resiliency. There's been obviously a lot of funds for resiliency and focus for resiliency around the state, and looking at how not just coastal counties, but throughout the state, what resiliency means. And for us, it comes back to the definition that connected areas are inherently more resilient than isolated patches, which sort of reinforces the idea of connected conservation. So our organization has focused in on some of the places in the corridor that are narrowest, either bottlenecks, as we call them, where a break in that chain would, really affect the integrity or the connection of the whole, and also those development hotspots. And this is just a look statewide at 14 places, around this larger corridor that are either very narrow or where there's a lot of development pressure on those existing connections. And we've been working with partners to figure out what are the approaches for those places. Our state land acquisition programs are wonderful. Sometimes that can take a long time. And so what are other ways that we can be working together with all the local stakeholders who care about protecting the corridor in their backyard? And here's just a zoom in at one of those. So this is the upper end of the north end of this CHNEP boundary, basically right outside Lakeland. And you can see the wildlife corridor here is a very narrow, sort of single remaining thread, where the larger wildlife corridor to the east is still, much more wide. But this is a place where, it's going to take a lot of effort and people to come together to be able to say, yes, we're interested in prioritizing protections for this and keeping this one narrow strand viable. So I think we're holding a workshop in Polk County next, very soon, to be talking about that. But we bring attention to the wildlife corridor really through art, storytelling, and a lot of other ways. This is our office in St. Pete. Please come visit us if you're in the area. But one of the things we have is a mural here. And we're using that approach in a lot of gateway communities to the wildlife corridor to help raise local community pride around the natural resource offerings, and really making tourists understand that this is a place where you can come, spend your dollars and support, and visit the wildlife corridor. So we have murals also in Crystal River and Brooksville so far. We're looking at others around the state this year. Similarly, we have a statewide campaign. We have a art exhibit that's been at the Florida House for the last year. It's coming down this week, and it's moving to the Florida State Fair. So if you're at the fair, February 8th through the 19th, I think, come check that out. It will be in the barn that also houses the Florida Cattlemen's and the Florida Forest Service. Those are logical partners for us because we really, the wildlife corridor has always recognized the value of working lands, and it's part of the story of, both agriculture and forestry are the largest uses in the wildlife corridor for those remaining, for all the agricultural areas. And then I have a goal of ultimately branding, and our team does, of ultimately branding the wildlife corridor consistently so that wherever you are in the state and you come into the wildlife corridor area, or you go visit a state park or preserve that's in the wildlife corridor, there would be consistent branding. So that is something that we'd like to work on and try and roll out across all the partners. Again, there's every state and federal landowner represented in the wildlife corridor, a lot of private landowners, a lot of counties and cities. And so it's a massive effort to get us all on the same page, but that's a goal. And then we do a lot of gatherings that are also all about just continuing to build a momentum and inspiration for protecting the corridor and working across this very sort of large and disparate group. So this is from our first Corridor Connect Summit in 2022. We held the last one last year with over 500 people. Jennifer was there, one of our speakers, and very well received. And we continue to look at ways to prioritize safe passage for wildlife. This is under I-4, a new wildlife underpass that's being constructed between Lakeland and Orlando in one of those remaining last green threads. And the White House CEQ representative came to visit and tour this with us. And that one's now open. This is just kind of a look at all the different entities and groups that are needed to be represented at the table every day when we're talking about collaborative conservation. It takes all of us, and it takes all of us overlapping and working together. And so in wrap up, I'll just say that if we achieve this goal of connected conservation, it will help for all the things that wildlife needs, but also humans rely on. And that's food production, locally, water, clean and abundant fresh water, also restored processes. So healthy intact floodplains and restored floodplains like the Kissimmee River, and safe passage for humans and wildlife alike, and multiple habitat types, and then ultimately resiliency and storms. So that's kind of a broad view of the wildlife corridor, and we'd glad to take any questions.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Like, Erin? That was awesome.
Quick, because I knew we were a little behind and they're trying to keep you on time, and I had a lot of slides, but I find that photos really do help tell the story.
So Mallory, were you on those first two? You were central to those first two expeditions.
And I've gotten to go on some portion of all of them. So now I've been part of 6 different conservation treks and trekked over 2,600 miles across the state.
Wow. Okay. What was the most challenging habitat type of those 2,600 miles?
People look at the photos oftentimes when we're sort of chest deep in the swamp and working our way through and think that was the scariest time. The scariest time for me was always biking on the roads with traffic. That is far more life-threatening than, so it just depends on what your perspective is. But.
Does anyone have questions for Mallory?
I mean, Mallory, do you know, like offhand, you might know, like the amount of money that's already been appropriated to date, if you add up all the different.
The last 2 years, the state appropriations have totaled $2 billion for land acquisition. And so since the act has passed, there was over $1 billion last year, which is a record, and then 400 million the previous 2 years. Yeah, so.
This is really historic, and this is just exactly what we wanted to bring to you because it affects each of your communities. And Mallory's here to answer any questions you have about how this is going to proceed and what the next steps are.
A comment. Yesterday, 1,000 Friends of Florida at noontime had a webinar, and you got a lot of good publicity.
Thank you. I've listened into that, and it was a great program. That was all about agriculture, and I think there's so much with preserving the wildlife corridor, or doing our best to offer up protections for the wildlife corridor and protecting Florida's agricultural producing regions, which is important to all of us. So that's a nice overlap. They do a great series of webinars. And on that, Jennifer, so one of the things that we've been told is that the wildlife corridor effort has really helped to re-energize the land protection community across the state of Florida. Obviously having funding there is really helpful, but I think also this vision, a statewide plan and vision, is also sort of driving that. People, and some of your comments recognize this today, wherever you are in the state of Florida, you can, and you drive a road you haven't been on in a while and you come back, there's changes to it. So the landscape is changing really quickly, and it helps folks to say there is this plan, there is this alternative, and progress is being made. So that's a big part of what we do, is try to celebrate the wins along the way through our social media. So I just encourage you to follow along. That's here on all those channels. And also just a reminder that there are resources available for local and regional planning and decision making to help visualize and consider the wildlife corridor and its associated ecological layers in your decision making, as well as the development projections. All that data is available. I'd be glad to talk to you at the county and local level, about how to incorporate that if you're not already using any of those tools or resources. Yeah.
I guess the last question, I mean, oh, do you have a question?
It was probably a silly one, but are these marked out somewhere or just on the maps on your website?
So all the maps are found on our website, floridawildlifecorridor.org. But they're also available for download on a number of different places that UF Center for Landscape Conservation Planning through FNA, the Florida Natural Areas Inventory. You can, and I can talk to anyone who wants to be able to download the KMZ layers or for the corridor itself to be able to overlay that with your county GIS information.
Great, thank you.
I guess the question I had was just like, how does this intersect with the other two initiatives that we just heard about?
Yes, so the wildlife corridor is sort of this bigger 18 million acre statewide vision, right? And then you just heard about two other proposals that would add additional layers of conservation over portions in the CHNEP boundary and in portions of the wildlife corridor. So, you know, the Myakka and Peace Rivers are both represented in the wildlife corridor. We're supportive of things like wild and scenic designation, understanding that process does try and take into account all the stakeholder needs. That's exactly the collaborative conservation focus that we have, you know, and the Everglades to Gulf. Yeah, I always get that wrong. The Everglades Gulf Conservation Area that Julie was just talking about is another layer that helps landowners who are interested in selling conservation easements just have that one more thing. We know there's more competition than there are dollars. And so if you can say, I'm in the wildlife corridor, I'm in the Everglades Gulf Conservation, you know, protection area, I can look for matching then now state funds with local funds and federal funds. So we supported it as just additional options and flexibility for landowners. Again, if there's no regulatory component of that, but it is a additional layer of conservation, recognizing the sort of importance of the region and all the biodiversity values that Julie mentioned. Yeah, so there are a lot of regional initiatives, and that's very important. Again, this 18 million acre view it's much more, it works better when a lot of local areas like yourself and regional planning efforts collaborate to look at what's most important to those regions. So for example, there's also all the regional planning councils overlap the wildlife corridor, of course, but there are also these sentinel landscapes around Avon Park Sentinel Landscape, the Northwest Florida Sentinel Landscape, and a proposed Northeast Florida Sentinel Landscape. Florida would be the only state with 3 sentinel landscapes that is encouraging the cooperation of the federal agencies, the state agencies, local governments, all in looking at those regional priorities and needs. In that case, protecting and buffering military bases, but also their conservation opportunities to do that. So,
Thank you so much for coming, Mallory. Appreciate
thank you
it.
for having me. Great to be with you all.